Next, we have Dr. James Whittington. James works at Oxford and Stanford. He has been at Oxford since he was 18, first doing a physics undergraduate and then master's, then medical school, then a PhD. He is now a Sir Henry Wellcome Fellow. His PhD was with Rafael Bogas and Tim Behrens, and his work tries to mechanistically understand how neural networks, both artificial and biological, solve structured tasks. So we're very excited to welcome James for a talk today. Join me in thanking him.
Okay, I've tried to do it so you can see the bottom. Okay, thank you very much for having me here today. And first, I should apologize that I'm only talking because someone unfortunately couldn't make it either. The real speaker couldn't make it either in person or virtually, so you've been lumped with me, I'm afraid. But I'm going to nevertheless talk about unifying the mechanisms of the hippocampal and prefrontal cognitive maps. And sort of in other words, it's going to be really about unifying hippocampal and prefrontal mechanisms of sequence memory, because sequence memory is, after all, really what cognitive maps are about. Before we start thinking about the mechanisms, I'm going to just have a look at some of the cells in the brain that care about cognitive maps and representing sequences. So what you're seeing, well, we saw something like this earlier. So what you're seeing is, here's a top-down view of a box, and that black trajectory is everywhere a rodent has run around. And every time you see a red dot, that is where this one particular cell has fired. And so we can convert that into what's known as a rate map. And this cell seems to likes to care about bits of the space that lie on a triangular grid. And this is called a grid cell. So there's lots of this sort of cell is found in entorhinal cortex. There's lots of other cells found in entorhinal cortex that also care about space. So for example, object vector cells. These are cells that fire the vectorial distances away from these white objects in the room. You also find border cells. These are cells that care about the borders. And in hippocampus, you find a variety of other cells as well. So for example, place cells, a bit like grid cells, but they don't care for lots of locations. They just generally care for one location. Or landmark cells. These are cells a little bit like object vector cells, but rather than coding for that vectorial difference to all objects, they just code to some objects. And so, as I said, all of these cells in the hippocampal formation, that's on the side of your brain, all seem to care a little bit about, they sort of map your space, and they code for sequences. Cells for the cognitive map. However, the front of your brain actually solves kind of similar problems. Apparently it solves these sort of cognitive maps and sequence problems. However, when you look at the cell representation of the brain, which I'm not really showing here, they look really very different. They look very, very, very different to the ones that you find in hippocampus. Okay, I'm not going to explain quite what they look right now, because I'll sort of overload your brain with too many cells. But we'll get back to it a little bit later. But the thing that we can take away right now is that these cells in the hippocampal formation, they always care about what are you seeing right here and right now. Where am I? What am I seeing? Etc. Whereas these cells in prefrontal cortex, they care about not just right now, but they care about your future and your past. So there's some sort of difference already that we know about. That difference, the difference of why these cells look different, is what's going to be the puzzle that we're going to try to tackle in this talk. Okay, to tackle this problem, we really need to sort of formalize and think about what are sequence memory problems, because as I said, these sequence memory is the same as cognitive maps and so on. Okay, so here is a sequence problem. So first I show you Jill, then I show you Phil, then I show you Kate, then Jill, then Phil, and I ask you what comes next. Okay? I suspect you know it's going to be Kate. Likewise, I could show you a banana, a book, a bed, a banana, book, and then ask you what comes next. Is a bed? Yeah, you're right. Okay, good. Okay. So can you see that this problem had sort of two components? Okay, one was this sort of component. You repeat three things in a row. You do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, ABC, ABC. And the other thing is you have to remember what you saw before. Okay. Sequence memory problems are also much more complicated than that simple one. So here's an example of a sequence problem. So I'm going to tell you a stream of sensory observations and relations, like light bulb, right, broom, down, motorcycle, right, etc., etc., etc. And all the way when you get to the banana, I say, what are you going to see when you go up? This one, I'm pretty sure you won't be able to answer. However, it becomes an awful lot easier solving these problems if you have some underlying understanding of the sort of abstraction that's common to all sequences. Because if you know that abstraction, then you can place these observations down on that scaffold And now when we get to the banana and we ask what happens when we go up, we know that we're going to find the light bulb, and we do. Okay, and so it's really what I try to convince you here of is that knowing this abstraction, or in this case, that all of the sequences are spatial, knowing this abstraction really helps you predict what comes next. And this is true whether that sequence was generated from a spatial environment, or whether it was generated from, here's an environment of your family tree, or binary tree structure. You can predict what comes next better, also on a new task that you've never seen before, you can predict what comes next better if you know what the underlying common structure is. Therefore, we should in theory be able to take these prediction problems and train models on them, and then they should be able to learn these abstractions. We'll do a little bit of that later. Okay, and so what's actually required to solve these problems? Well, firstly, as we saw, it really, really helps if you have an understanding of the abstract relational structure. In fact, it's the only way you can make some predictions if you know this. And the second thing you need to know is you need to have a memory system, because just like you needed to remember who Kate was in order to make the prediction of Kate, so you need to memory so you can know who goes where in each situation. So there's two components. You need to know about the abstraction, you need a memory. Two things you need. Okay, and so we're ready for our first model then. And this is going to be a model of the hippocampal formation. And this model takes these two ideas really very literally. Okay, and really it just consists of two components. Can you see my mouse? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so it consists of two components. First component is just going to be a part of the model which cares about this abstraction. In fact, it cares about where you are in this abstraction as we're sort of navigating the world, seeing the sequence, works out where you are. And the second part, so we can see it's going to look a bit like this. Its representation is going to be able to do this path integration. They're going to track round. And the second part is just going to be a memory system. And so it's just going to bind together what it saw at each location. So for example, in this particular environment, the bed might have gone at the 0-tooth location, and the table was at the 2-tooth location, and so on. But that memory system is going to be very flexible. And what I mean by that is in different situations, different sequences, it will be able to do different bindings. Okay, it's a binding system. And this binding system is really what's going to allow the system to generalize, to be able to understand any sequence, because we're able to reuse this same common understanding across different sequences. That allows for generalization. Okay. Ooh. Oh dear. Okay. So let's have a look at what this model learns. Well, when we train it on spatial sequences, remember this model, all it sees is sequences of observations. It never sees an underlying structure. It learns cells that look a lot like cells in the brain. So if this is the cells that it's learning in this RNN, in this path integration. It learns things that look like grid cells, and that looks like grid cells in the brain. It learns things that look like band cells. I didn't show you them earlier, but you find band cells in entorhinal cortex as well. And border cells. If you put these objects in there, special objects, it learns object vector cells, sorry. So here's a cell, that this cell here always fires 5 steps north of the white object, and this cell always fires 5 steps east of the object, just like object vector cells in the brain as well. And it also learns place cells, little ones, big ones, landmark cells, and so on. And this is all just trained on spatial sequences. Of course, we can do more funky things, and we can do things a little bit more exciting in space. So we can train on things which are space plus very, very abstract, non-spatial behaviors. I'm not actually going to, for the interest of time, I'm just going to skip through them. But the point is, this model, with the very, very, very same principles, the only principle it's got is have an RNN, a system of path integration, and have a memory system. I should say that everything's learned in the end. But there are only two principles, and those two principles, very same network, can learn all of these tasks, which really cover a very wide array of the representations found in hippocampal formation now. Same principles, predict a lot of cells. And these are really, really very abstract cells. So these are like evidence accumulation cells, or sort of which lap am I on cell? Have I gone left or right cell? Okay, really quite abstract now. Okay, so, as a bit of a side note, being that we're a maths and neuroscience and AI conference, so this model we've built is actually mathematically related to transformers, okay? And so a bit like ChatGPT and so on. And of course, I can ask ChatGPT, are you related to the hippocampus? And it says yes, and cites the stuff. Okay, so that's good. Okay, another AI bit. These very same ideas of just having this RNN that can interact with a memory system, if you scale it up now, by, for example, adding more layers of the RNN, and each interacting with this memory system, which will look a little bit like this to anyone that's sort of familiar with these AI diagrams of having blocks of transformer layers and so on. If you scale this very same idea up, you're able to create models which actually perform, well, for their given size, perform the best out there. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is how well the models are doing with the amount of training it's had. Okay, so you can see these models are the ones that I'm talking about that have this exact structure, and they essentially do the best given the very limited amount of training they have. Okay, so there's something in this. Okay. So it feels like we should just be able to sit back and relax and claim victory. But the main problem is that when we come to think about prefrontal cortex, this model does a terrible job. Okay? It basically predicts almost nothing there. It gets everything wrong. So there's something we really need to think about. And if you remember, at the very beginning, I said there's some difference between what the cells are doing. So the cells in the hippocampal formation, they're telling you about what you're seeing right here, right now, where you are, and so on. But these cells in the prefrontal cortex, they're telling you about the whole future, your whole past. Okay. And so let's dig into that a little bit, and let's see where that takes us. And we'll dig into it with an example. Okay, so here is a task, and this monkey has been trained to see 3 things in a row and then repeat those 3 things in a row. So in particular, it's looking at a screen, and there's 6 possible lights on that screen, and one light comes up, then another light, then a third light, then there's a delay period, and then the monkey needs to look saccade to the targets to the lights in order that they came. And of course, it's not just trained on one sequence, it's trained on a whole variety of different sequences. So it really has to learn something general to be able to perform these tasks. This task is really like so it looks like this. You see light number 1, light number 5, light number 4, and then you need to predict what comes next. And that's really like the sort of task that we've seen before. Okay, so the sequences are like you've been walking around on this graph. And what they discover, this is during this delay period now, is that the neural representation decomposes into 3 different subspaces. So you get 3 different subspaces, where the first subspace encodes what was observed first, the second subspace encodes what was encoded second, and the third subspace encodes what was encoded third. And remember, this is during the delay period, so it's decomposed into 3 subspaces. And this isn't like the easiest plot to parse, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit easier. And I hope people at the back can see this. So what does this mean? So if we're kind to ourselves, and we now think of these subspaces not as subspaces, but really as like separate populations of neurons, it means if we saw the sequence 1, 3, 4, then during the delay period, neuron number 1 of the first set of subspace is active, neuron number 3 of the second subspace is active, and neuron number 4 of the third subspace is active during this delay period. Equally, if we saw 5, 2, 6, then it would be the neuron number 5 of the first subspace, neuron number 2 of the second subspace, and neuron number 6 of the third subspace. Those would be the active neurons. Okay? So it's really clear, then, that these neurons are keeping a whole memory of the past, because at the moment it's seeing nothing, but it's encoding everything that it's seen before, but it's also encoding everything that it's going to see in the future as well. Of course, there's a very famous type of neural network that has this sort of internal memory, and that's a recurrent neural network. So I'm definitely not the first to propose that recurrent neural networks are what prefrontal cortex are doing. There's a whole bunch of studies that do that. I'm just flashing a few up. But what we're going to try to do now on these tasks is really give like a mechanistic understanding of how these RNNs are actually solving these tasks. Okay? And we'll see that mechanistic understanding, time permitting, is very much related to the previous model we saw, but just in a different format. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We're going to try to make a hypothesis for how a trained RNN would solve these tasks. Okay, and so let's start with a nice and simple task. As that's going to be a little simple task where we're going to observe sequences that are drawn from this graph structure. And again, we're not seeing the graph structure, but we're just going to see sequences from that structure. And what I'm going to say is that actually, just like those neurons that we saw before, that the RNN will decompose into 3 subspaces. Again, we're being kind to ourselves and we're putting them in different neurons. 3 subspaces, 3 sets of neurons, structured with a connectivity profile mirroring the connectivity profile of the environment. Okay, let's see how this works. Okay, let's say I start here. So I observe my first element of the sequence is an ear. And so I see an ear, I load it into the first, I'm going to call it slot. These subspaces are going to enable slots, okay? Load it into the first slot. Okay, then we, in reality, we move here, but we just observe a banana now. But we rotate this around to this subspace, so we see this sort of anti-clockwise action. We rotate it anti-clockwise. And so now this neuron is sort of representing one ear away from me. And then we see a bed. We load the bed in. We then go anti-clockwise again. So we shuffle all the information around. So now the ear is over here and the bed is over here. And then we observe a banana, so we load a banana in. Okay, so we've loaded everything in now, and now we can answer all these counterfactual questions that we can give it. You know, it's like, what happens if you go backwards? It's never done this before, but we can go going backwards just means shuffling it all clockwise now, and of course we can now just make the prediction that this is the bed one, and we're going to be right. And this sort of structuring these subspaces according to the structure of the world, in fact, isn't just for these simple tasks like that, 1D task. It also works for this spatial task. Okay, so we see a chair, we move up. So we load in the chair, we move up, we shuffle up the representation to the next slot. We see a motorbike, we go right, we shuffle the representation over. We then see a book, we go up, we shuffle all the representations up. Okay, so hopefully you can see that all we're doing is copying and shifting between these subspaces, but that mechanism allows us to make all sorts of predictions and inferences of things that we've never seen before. Okay, so it's ends up being just as powerful as the previous model. Okay, hopefully that made sense. The question we're going to try to tackle now is, do RNNs actually learn this mechanistic model? Okay, because we just proposed it, do they actually learn it? Okay, so before we do that, so RNNs can actually solve our sequence task. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a really, really simple task where you're always just going around in the same direction. I repeat, you're just seeing a sequence. You never see that graph. You just see a sequence, but they are all drawn from the fact that you're going around in the same direction. Okay, and in different environments, so you see different sequences, okay, of different observations, but nevertheless, they're all drawn as if you went around in the same direction. Okay, so what we see here is we trained a bunch of RNNs on this task, just next step prediction, and different colors to different sizes. And so we can see that they can all solve these. So what we're saying when it says task size, means how many nodes are in the graph. Okay, so in this case, there'd be 5, so it would be down here. Okay, and different colors, as I said, different RNNs. So we can see the bigger RNN can solve bigger tasks, but they can all solve the smaller tasks, and they all can't solve the biggest tasks, as you would expect. And that's for a variety of other sorts of tasks, whether you be doing a classic n-back task, you do just 1D navigation, 2D navigation, all have the same properties. Bigger networks can solve the task, smaller networks can, but just can't solve as big tasks. Okay, so RNNs can solve our tasks, good. Do they learn these slots? Do they learn these structured slots? Okay, so let's just put a simple example of what we're going to expect to see. So let's see this very, very simple 1D navigation task. The prediction is that our neurons, our RNN decomposes into these 3 separate slots. So that makes a real prediction. What it says is that I should be able to make a decoder for every single one of those slots. So I have a decoder for slot 3, decoder for slot 2, decoder for slot 1, and each of those decoders, across all different sequences that you can think of, it should be able to learn to predict what is the contents of that slot. It should be able to, learn to decode the contents of that slot over all possible sequences. So I can train that decoder for each slot, and I can try to train it. And if the RNN really had learned this slot model, then I would be able to decode these things. And I can. It turns out you can. It turns out that's what the blue line is. The RNN, you can decode the predicted contents of every slot. Okay, that's not possible. It's not. And so I should say these RNNs don't just encode. Sorry, the RNNs don't just represent past observations, because you can't decode that. It's the orange line. But they really represent it in this very structured slot way. That's the blue line. Okay, this also works with 2D navigation. Exactly the same phenomena. You can decode the slots. You can't decode past observations. Okay, so that's what decoding, but what do neurons actually look like? So if you actually come and look at the neurons, well, it's a bit of a pickle. They don't really look like slots. So these neurons, I should say, what I'm showing here is these are the neurons along the x-axis, and the y is just like how much do I represent one of the slots. Okay, we know it's representing these slots subspaces, but are the neurons aligned to each particular slot? Okay, so we can see that they're not, just natively. But if we apply constraints, or like when you're training, just apply some constraints from the disentanglement literature, if anyone's familiar with that. It's just like very simple constraints. Then you really do learn this situation where you have separate neurons for separate slots, okay? So it always learns slots, but sometimes you can force it to learn this beautiful situation where single neurons only care about one slot, okay? Okay, so RNN seems to learn slots, as we hypothesized. Does it actually tell us anything about the brain? So first, let's return to this task. So as I said, during this delay period, and this task where they go ABC, ABC, this delay period, it really is the case that the real neurons and prefrontal cortex decompose into 3 subspaces, and that's also true in the RNN as well. What's going on? What's the interpretation? Well, it is exactly this model that we've got right here, okay? So when we first enter, we load something into the first slot, we rotate it around, we've done that, rotate it around, now we're here, we load something into the first slot, we rotate it around, now we're here, we load something into the first slot, okay. Great. Now this is the activity in the delay period, so slot 1, 2, and 3, that's exactly what we're seeing here. And now if we want to make predictions, all we do is we just shuffle things around, make a prediction. Shuffle things around, make a prediction. Shuffle things around, make a prediction, okay. So that's the hypothesis of how to solve this task, and that is what the neurons look like. Okay, so it's not just these sort of sequential tasks in frontal cortex that we can explain. We can also explain these quite interesting cue-dependent tasks. Okay, so here is another task where I'm going to show you monkeys again. I'm going to show monkeys 2 stimuli at once. Okay, there'll be a color on the top and a color on the bottom. And then there's going to be a delay period, and then I'm going to give it a cue which says either report what the color on the top was or report what the color on the bottom was. And then after a delay, and then the monkey needs to choose. Okay? And again, it's going to be chosen random colors on the top or the bottom. Okay? So it's a memory task, but there's some weird sequentialness to it where it's sort of indicated, it's cued whether it should go report the top or the bottom. Okay, what they observe in monkeys is during this delay, the delay before the cue, you have these orthogonal subspaces, but then during the delay after, so orthogonal subspaces with one subspace encoding what was on the top and one subspace encoding what was on the bottom. And then in the second delay period, you have these subspaces that sort of go parallel. Again, that's exactly what an RNN learns. Okay, so what's going on mechanistically? Well, initially, when we see these 2 stimuli, we encode one, whichever's on the top in the top slot, and whatever's on the bottom in the bottom slot. Then if we see it, that's this activity in this delay period. Now if we see a cue, and the cue says do nothing, the bottom slot, sorry, so report what's on the bottom, then we don't need to do anything, because we always read out from this bottom slot. Okay. However, if the cue was the top cue, then we need to shuffle things around. Okay. And so now whatever's on the top goes to the bottom, whatever's on the bottom goes to the slot, and so then we read out now what was on the top. Okay. And so that's why these things now look orthogonal. I didn't tell you that. It's actually, there's orthogonality, so there's parallels. They look parallels because parallel is actually conditional on whether you are the chosen one. Okay, so that's all that we're looking at is then this bottom slot here. That's what's happening here. Okay, so there's whole other representations that can be, but for the interest of time, I'm not allowed to go through them. But it's not just these discrete tasks that we've got. You can also do continuous tasks. And so now your neurons don't represent these discrete slots. You sort of represent a continuous manifold of slots. Okay. Okay, so lastly, with any time that I have remaining, but just cut me off at any point, I want to show you these 2 algorithms that we've described here are in fact mathematically equivalent, and that's what we're going to do now. So the key difference between the 2 algorithms, just in high-level words, is that one of them, this sort of slot-based one, stores memories inside neural activity. It stores memories in neurons. This one over here, however, stores memories in synaptic connections, in weights, in a Hopfield network. Okay, so to make this link, we're going to need a little maths. It's sort of, high school maths, so even I can do it. Okay, so for the prefrontal model, okay, we're going to look at tasks like ABC. So an example task might be 1, 2, 3, sorry, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4. Another example task might be 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. And the prediction was that our neurons will decompose into these slots. And so let's think of the mechanics of this model. So it says, right, if I want to update the contents of this RNN, so in this case, it just means that whatever's in slot 1, goes to slot 3, whatever's in slot 3 goes to slot 2, whatever's in slot 2 goes to slot 1. Okay, that's just going to be this matrix here. So we can see whatever's in slot 1 goes to slot 3, whatever's in slot 2 goes to slot 1, whatever's in slot 3 goes to slot 2. Okay, that's going to be this update equation. Okay, if we want to read out, so we always read out from slot 1. So that's just going to be a readout matrix which just attends to slot 1 effectively. Okay, and so we can put it all together now. And so this is the slightly more, okay, put it all together. And so it says if we want to make a prediction, the prediction that we make at position A, B, and C, is just going to be our readout matrix multiplied by this update matrix to the power 0, 1, or 3, 0, 1, or 2. multiplied by some initial representation, some memory representation, okay? So this bit here corresponds to the RNN. This bit here corresponds to just these readout weights, okay? But this is the equation that encapsulates everything that this model can do at each position. Okay, we'll remember that for later. Second, we're nearly there, don't worry. Second, for the hippocampal model. Okay, so you have to sort of trust me here that this model can be decomposed into a slightly simpler model, which has the following form. Okay, so we have some position representations that get updated by some path integrator. So again, if I'm in position A, B, and C, so that says that position A goes to B, B goes to, well, you know, you get the picture. This is just a position update. And now I want to make my weight matrix now is going to be my memories. So these neurons, see these synapses here, will correspond to the memory that is really at position A. And these synapses will be the memory at position B, and these synapses are the memory at position C. So it's going to look like this. And again, we can look at the same equation that encapsulates this whole model. The prediction at every time step is now going to be these memories in a set of weights, multiplied by the weight that updates where you are, to the power 0, 1, or 2, multiplied by some initial position representation. Okay, and so hopefully, if you can see the bottom, you can see that these equations are basically the same. All you've done is you've taken the 3 blocks, 3 components, and you just reshaped them and resized them. Okay, so what was synaptic connections here is just a neural activity. What was a update my position is now update the slots. What was position A is now read out from slot 1. Okay, so there's exactly the same things going on, just reshaped and rearranged. Okay, they're the same thing. Okay, and I'll just skip this bit. And okay, in summary, so what I've tried to show is there's 2 algorithms that solve the same cognitive map problem. So this slot-like algorithm, which stores memories and neurons, and this other algorithm that stores memories and synaptic connections. And each of these algorithms accounts for brain data in different brain regions. So this one, hippocampal formation, this one, prefrontal cortex. That's it. Thank you very much.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. Very good talk.
Thank you very much for your great talk. So if neuronal and synaptic representations are equivalent, then isn't synaptic representation a waste? Because we've got tons of synapses and just like O of n neurons.
Okay, so the synaptic one a waste. Well, okay, one thing you might be able to notice between these 2 ones is that the number of neurons you need to encode to solve this task in terms of your RNN is much larger than the number of neurons here. Okay, so here you need the number of neurons you need is of order the number of positions in the task, whereas this of order number of positions multiplied by the dimensionality of your input. Neurons in one case than the other, so that would be an argument against that. Yeah.
Really great talk, thanks. In the activity-based account, do you see these slots as accounting for like observed, like remarkably low limitations on working memory capacity in like various recall tasks? Like I think it's like 4 or 5 or something, things you can
Yeah.
at once. And compared to the synaptic account, and also like it seems also maybe less flexible in that if you have a certain number of, you know, how do you learn a new? You have to update the recurrent weights as you learn the new structure.
So okay, firstly, they should be as flexible as each other. Okay, this exact relationship means they should in theory be as flexible as each other. Okay, it is true, however, that because there's more neurons in this case than this one, presumably this is harder to learn. Okay, so that might be one example. It's harder to learn. So that may be one argument against it. But they definitely should be as flexible as each other. And then your other point, I think, was related to the first one, is that because this requires many, many, many more neurons, that might account for the fact that why you can, to remember only 7 things would require lots of neurons, and so you can't remember as many things. And empirically, I haven't showed you the data, but training RNNs is also the case. You remember far fewer things in that one than you do in the other one. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm waving over. Hey. Thanks so much for the talk. I really like the setup of the models as well. I think maybe I'm asking a similar question to the previous one, but I'll try and make it clearer. So the concept I was trying to work out is that suppose you're training 2 different of the tasks that involve the slots, but you're actually thinking about tasks that one needs 10 slots and one only needs 2. Do you have an intuition or an idea for how a brain would switch between how many slots it's using at any one point in time? Thanks.
So this is I tried to allude to it, but this is some of the data I didn't present, and both in model and in experimental data. So in that situation, rather than having these discrete slots, which people in working memory don't really like the idea of discrete slots, but rather than having these discrete slots, what you can do is you can essentially have it as a continuous attractor now, and you have this sort of slot manifold. And so if I've only got 2 observations or 2 things in my world, it's just the rate at which I need to move around that manifold is different to if I've got 10 things. Okay, so in 10 things I move around at 1/10 of the speed. If I've got 2 things, I move around at half of the speed. Okay, and so it ends up making a prediction about the sort of velocity signals that you should observe. But the exact idea works whether it's discrete or continuous. It's just discrete, it's a little bit easier to visualize. Yeah.
One more.
Thank you so much for the interesting talk. I just have a conceptual question about exactly what kind of inputs you would need for this kind of model. So from my understanding, time series model usually just reads in observations from your environment. But it seems that here you are also dealing with space, which means that you need to take in, for example, which direction you're moving in. So could you explain a bit more about...
So if you want to make predictions of sort of directions you've never seen before, on the very first time you take that direction, you can't do it without an action signal. Okay, if you don't have any action signals, you're limited to just going around on loops, basically, going in the same direction the whole time. So yeah, so the inputs to this are a sequence where you see an observation and the associated action. So that's the inputs.
Right. Thank you so much.
It just means you can do more complicated sequences.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.